Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Laeed and I'm a senior lecturer here at the Rhodes School of Journalism and Media Studies in Makanda. And I'll be your host today alongside my colleague Julian Jacobs. Just before we start today's seminar, we've got a few quick house rules. So with the exception of the speakers, I'd like you to ask you to all just mute your sound and switch off your video feeds. You can pose questions via the chat panel. So just click on chat and type. We'll be addressing questions after the first introductory statements. And also please note that the event is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards in an email. So now that we've got the house rules done, I'd like to welcome everybody to the second webinar in our series, Our Futures, Our New Normals. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Laeed, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you might find yourself. Thank you for joining us. We're excited. We have 90 minutes of conversations that we hope would be beneficial for you. We have 4 wonderful speakers, and I will just briefly mention their names, and they will basically introduce themselves later. You would have seen their bios on the website, so we thank you for joining us, and thank you to our speakers. First, we have Teldah Mawarire. She will kick us off later, and then we have Malan. We have Professor Laeed Zaghlami, all the way from Algeria. And then we have Mandy Smallhorn-Croft. She will also talk to us about science, journalism, and who are the truth tellers. Can we trust journalists? Can we trust government officials? Can we trust scientists? So yeah, let's over to you again, Laeed.
Yeah. So just to remember, Mandy unfortunately has a problem with her webcam, so she'll only be joining us on sound. And just also to remind everybody that this is a Highway Africa event, Highway Africa project of the Rhodes School of Journalism and Media Studies here in Makanda in South Africa. So first up, we've got Teldah Mawarire. She's from Internews and she's been hard at work putting out a research report, which is kind of in the press as we speak. She's hoping it's going to be out on their website in about a week or 2. And we'll post the link actually in the chat for those of you who are not familiar with the Internews website. You should watch that like a hawk to get that report, because it's really, really relevant right now, looking at journalists reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic across Southern Africa and the challenges they face. Teldah, can you give us a run through of some of the challenges journalists are facing in the region?
Thank you, Laeed, and thank you so much for the invitation to Highway Africa. I'm really pleased to be here. So basically, we looked in the last 2 months on the effects on freedom of expression and access to information by COVID-19, to see how COVID-19 is impacting on this freedom. And basically 3 main findings that we made. Firstly is the issue of legislation, that a lot of governments in the region, so we looked at about 7 countries that included Zimbabwe, Zambia, Eswatini, Lesotho, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi. And we found that there is a lot of legislation that has been passed, such as the Disaster Management Acts, the State of Emergency Act, the Public Health Acts that are responding to COVID, that infringe on freedom of expression. So they are meant to respond to COVID, but then we find that they are really infringing on freedom of expression and curtailing free speech. Some of these laws have got clauses that are prescriptive to journalists in terms of sourcing. For example, you cannot use any other source of information other than government statistics. And this is really problematic for good, robust journalism. We have issues of excesses in the laws. For example, in Zimbabwe, you face a penalty of up to 20 years in jail for creating or sharing fake news. And what we found in speaking to the journalists is that journalists are starting to self-censor because they are really, afraid of these clauses that are in these laws. These laws also have got no sunset clauses as well as to, when they will end. So they are open-ended and open to abuse. We also found in our research in these countries that for the journalists themselves, where press freedom was difficult before the onset of COVID-19, it has become even more difficult now. So for journalists, there's things like a lot of journalists have reported reductions in incomes because their media houses are under financial pressure. There's the issue of, so we have journalists who reported up to 50% cuts in salaries. We have issues of mental integrity where journalists are facing, such a barrage of COVID-19 such that it's affecting a lot of them mentally, leading to, conditions of depression and so forth. In certain countries, Zimbabwe and Malawi in particular, there was an acute lack of PPEs, of protective clothing from the employer for journalists. So many said they were even accessing, isolation centers without protective clothing, and they felt very unsafe. There were issues of restrictions around the movement for journalists, even where they have been declared an essential service in Zimbabwe, even here in South Africa. As well, the inability sometimes to move freely and being hindered by uniformed forces, soldiers, police, and so forth. And then lastly, I think one of the other major findings we found was on media sustainability, especially of print media. Print media is under so much pressure, such that we can expect the closure of so much more print media in the region. Media houses complained not only of reduction in advertising revenue, most rely on advertising. There was also the issue of equipment that most of their journalists require laptops and data and so forth to work from home. They don't always have this. And then lastly, media houses also spoke a lot about governments who are using COVID-19 to deal with media that they have not always liked or who have not always reported favorably on them. This, I think, was a case in point, for example, in Zambia, where Prime TV, which is quite a popular TV station, was closed down after a spat with government about its refusal to provide free health advertising to the government. So, there's issues like this, and issues also, just to return to the issue of journalists, the issue of harassment. In Eswatini, at the time of doing the report, we had 2 editors who were in hiding and who were on the run after they reported that certain government officials had been infected with COVID-19. So this is what we found in the last 2 months in terms of effects of COVID-19 on freedom of expression, and especially on the media and journalism.
Yeah, so Teldah, that is a worrying report. One would have actually thought that, after dealing with the epidemic of HIV/AIDS, our governments would have learned in Southern Africa that the best way to deal with the epidemic is to listen to the scientists, listen to those whistleblowers in health institutions. Julian, you want to speak to Mia about this?
Yeah, thank you, Laeed. Thank you, Teldah. Mia, in terms of, you've been around for a while and you've reported on 2 epidemics, the HIV epidemic in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then now currently the COVID. And how do you think has the South African government kind of their response to this particular epidemic? And then secondly, in terms of how does the 2 eras compare specifically, but also in terms of how do science journalists, how do they report, where do they get their information from, and can we trust these particular scientists? So perhaps you could kind of highlight some of your experiences in this regard.
Sure. Thank you very much, Julian, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I think the one very obvious difference between HIV and COVID is that HIV is a slow-moving epidemic and COVID is a fast one. And those environments present very different challenges for a reporter to report on it, where the science has been fast-tracked to get information and data to act on, to create vaccines and to look at treatment for COVID. In the case of HIV, that moved a lot slower. So there was better opportunities to report on studies and more time to figure it out, where in the case of COVID, that period is a lot shorter, and we have a lot of research that's being published as preprints, which means it wasn't peer reviewed by other scientists. So people didn't check out the methodology. The results are published before it has gone through a very thorough process of review. And that means that we often see results in COVID that's published by scientists that are retracted later or that are adjusted later. And it's very confusing for the public. But in terms of South Africa, of course, reporting on HIV and on COVID is almost a little bit like day and night, because our government's responses, at least initially, were so different. So initially with HIV in South Africa, our responses were based on quack science, essentially, where political leaders, our health minister and president at the time, doubted the cause of HIV as the cause of AIDS, and also refused people access to treatment based on not acknowledging very thoroughly proved science. And you can compare it a little bit to the COVID response of, say, the United States or Brazil, where the media report a lot on, what did Trump say now? Why did he say this again? It's almost like a bit of a comedy in some sorts, like it was with our health minister at the time, Mantushabalala-Msimang. And in South Africa, that is different this time around. During the Mantushabalala and Thabo Mbeki era, we reported a lot on he says, she says, or did Mantu say beetroot is a good treatment again, and sort of laughing at it a little bit, where now we report more on the science of it. Initially, our government's response to COVID was very evidence-based. It's still, based on sound science, but there's now disagreements on how that science should be communicated. And some people would argue that sometimes the government uses the science that fits at the moment. Examples of that would be, for instance, religious gatherings. It's clear the science tells us don't go to large gatherings, even if it's just 50 people, like it has to be in South Africa at the moment. Right. But the government made a decision to allow these gatherings, and it's hard for the media to then figure out why, if it's not communicated clearly. And obviously there are other things at play here, politics and having the approval of religious leaders. So that makes it very hard for the media to communicate those results. And also because the studies are fast-tracked and come out so quickly and it's not been peer-reviewed, it's very hard for the media. The media is not good at communicating uncertainty. It's a very complex thing to communicate because it requires you to understand whether there were biases in studies and the study design, whether a specific design was designed to sort of find cause and effect, or whether it was just associations. And an example of that could be, you may recall 2-3 months ago, there was a study in France that came out that lots of major outlets reported on as well, that said that found that smoking reduced your chances of getting serious COVID-19 disease. And that study that came out could not prove cause and effect. It was not the only study that really can prove it is a randomized control study, and it wasn't a randomized control study, and there was a lot of confusion in it around in the media. And it was sort of like reported as a miracle study. And when you see stuff like that, things that could you trust it or couldn't you trust it, there's a few rules you can follow, and one of it would be, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. It's probably not something that can be believed, especially, say, in the case of this smoking study. It had different results than any other study that has almost ever been done. It's quite clearly been proved, that smoking is not good for you. And also, when you get to fast-tracked research, you need to raise your eyebrows when you see a scientists speaking outside of their field. So if you're going to see a neuroscientist that's making pronouncements on the impact of COVID on smoking on your lungs, or a health economist who's promoting themselves as an expert on COVID vaccine trials, you need to ask questions and wonder, why is it that someone wants to speak outside of their field of expertise?
Right.
Very, very few credible scientists would do that.
Right. No, thank you for that. That's very interesting. I wonder what's happening in North Africa, Laeed.
Yes, we're lucky to have Professor Laeed Zaghlami with us today. He's just been telling us how, social media, as you know, from the Arab Spring days, has become really big in Algeria in particular. The last year, it's really taken off. 25 million people just in his country. He said it was signed up recently. And I'm quite interesting. We've sent you Teldah's report, Laeed. If that kind of sounds like similar things are happening in North Africa, and if so, how are journalists dealing with issues such as whistleblowers on social media, which I'm sure you must have a lot if your social media is so vibrant?
Yes, good morning everybody there in the panel and the participant. I am very pleased and delighted to be on the program. Of course, I think one of the challenges that the media themselves, the journalists themselves faces right now, as well as government alike, are the huge number of social media users. As I said to you, 25 million of Algerians now are very active on social media, particularly on Facebook and YouTube, and they are really constitute a headache for journalists. They are polluting the whole atmosphere of reporting and coverage of COVID. I'm not at ease at all when I see ordinary people jumping to the social media and writing everything they want without any ethical consideration or any guidelines. And this is very hurtful for us as professors and the media, and they don't care. The reason why there is such a huge number of Algerians shifting to the social media. For the only reason, they do not trust anymore the media, and the media for the last 10 or 15 years or so have been under strict control from the government. And that's why the people, the ordinary people feel not happy with the media. If they can find what they want, if they can't hear what they want, if they can see what they want, obviously they look for the other sources, or they become very service producer. And this is exactly a new phenomenon in Algeria. As a regime which has been under authoritarian, I would say, approach in media. Although, let's make it clear, when we look at the figures of the landscape, the media landscape, we find 40 television channels. Only 5 or 6 are public. We have 160 written newspaper. We have also 180 electronic press. And we have also around 60 radio stations, but most of them are public. Only few are on the web and they are private. But more importantly, as I said to you, 25 million of Algerians are now on the social media. And this is a really huge number. They can exert pressure on the government, on the authority, on the political authority, on the media. They can even influence. That's exactly more than that. The Algerian now, the journalists had to go to the press, to the social media to get their sources, and this is really a huge problem.
Thanks, Laeed. Yeah, I think really that's really important. So if your social media is more sort of vibrant and more engaging for the public than the actual newspapers, how do journalists actually report on social media? We've seen the whole issue of Dr. Teldah go big in the US. So it shows, sometimes you have controversial scientists. So you can't always just listen to the scientists. You need to kind of know a little bit of science. And I think that's where the Association of Science Journalists comes in, Julian.
Yeah, Before we go to Mandy, everybody should just be aware that you can ask us questions on the chat function. Guy Berger just alerted us there's a report on their website, on the UNESCO website, a UNESCO study, the crisis of press freedom and media viability. If you could just access that via the chat function. Mandy, in terms of your organization that you represent, how have you helped science journalists grow their skills in terms of reporting on a pandemic like COVID-19? Mandy? Remember, Mandy can only come to us via audio, unfortunately. Video is a bit problematic today. Mandy, can you hear me? If not...
Yes, it seems like Mandy is actually trying to connect. I see here on the sides function.
Right.
Before we, while we're waiting for her to connect, we'll see. Mia has actually posted a course for journalists. I don't know if that's still visible in the chat.
Up front.
In terms of this issue of dealing with getting your head around the science and, you know, not reporting, you know, science inaccurately. I don't know, Mia, if maybe you can post that for us again,
yeah,
just in case the people who've joined later weren't able to see that. So that's a special course that's just been developed in epidemiology. I think it's free, Mia. Anyone?
Yes, it was a course that was we presented over the past 3 weeks. It was in the evenings twice a week, and then we recorded all the lectures. So what I'm going to post now is recordings of those lectures and slides that anyone can access it.
Right. While we're looking for those links and stuff, let me ask this question to anyone of the panelists. Who can we trust? Can we trust journalists? Are they trustworthy enough?
Julian, I have something to say on that. You know, something that COVID has really changed for us is that we used to rely on health journalists or journalists who relatively frequently report on health issues to give us the information on diseases. But now COVID has changed that very, very dramatically. Everyone is reporting on COVID, which means that everyone has virtually become a health journalist. And that poses so many challenges because it means that journalists without any exposure to what studies look like or, you know, contacts, which scientists you can trust, have to report on an epidemic as a mainstream issue now. And that means we can say that's bad, or we can say we're going to embrace that because we can equip everyone with skills. And that's something that I have learned over the past 3 weeks with this course that we presented. It wasn't Bhekisisa who presented it, we hosted it. It was epidemiologists who presented it. And the people who joined, it was for Africa-based journalists, were very often not health journalists. It was political journalists and business journalists who were hungry for their to acquire this type of knowledge. So that showed me that it doesn't only have to be health journalists reporting on this epidemic. It really can be a wide range of journalists, and we need people with different backgrounds to do that. But what it required was, it's really not just journalists who need to give of themselves. These epidemiologists and scientists who joined us had to donate their time for free to spend 4 hours each week with journalists to do this. And I found that through this course, it really presented or made me very aware of the partnerships that can be formed between scientists and journalists that I wasn't aware of previously. I wasn't aware of epidemiologists being so willing to share their times, their expertise. And the main thing that they focused on was that we don't really always know as journalists is what studies can you trust and which ones can't you trust. And that doesn't mean which ones are good or bad studies. It means what studies can come up with what type of results and how to communicate that. And that really is something that I think we need to share among all journalists at the moment, to understand, could this particular study tell you whether something caused something or not? Because that helps us to communicate, uncertainty or certainty in the media. And that's a really important thing that I think we can take from COVID and sort of build further on. But whether you can trust something or a scientist, if I look at South Africa, we have excellent scientists. I mean, lots of them were developed during the HIV period because there were so many opportunities for research. And those are exactly almost the same scientists we're dealing with COVID, because they were all infectious diseases scientists. And that's what we need now. And COVID is a new disease. We don't have old scientists to deal with COVID. It's all developing in a new light. And I think when you read a story in the media, the main thing that you must ask yourself of whether you can believe it or not, if it's about a study, is, did that journalist just report that study, or did they tell you the limitations of that study? And most importantly, did they include the opinions of independent other scientists who were not involved in that study? Because during a time of such uncertainty as we're dealing with now, there's really no way you can just take a study and report on it and regard it as the ultimate truth. You need other opinions on it and people to tell you, no science is just 100% accurate. What about it? What confounding factors were there? And what about it? Which part can you be certain of and which part can you not be certain of? And if we can communicate information during COVID like that, I think we will do the public a lot of favors.
Great. No, thanks for that. Teldah, any ideas, any feelings on this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and great points from me that I totally agree with. I think I'll just add that in terms of who can we trust, in terms of, who has been put on the agenda, journalists, governments, whistleblowers, I would say interrogate the agenda behind whatever is being reported, because there are so many agendas, I think, that are going on at the moment. So there's need for journalists to interrogate what are the agendas. What's the agenda behind a certain report? I think if I put on my activist cap, there's also the narrative of, capitalism everywhere that needs to be interrogated. So the capitalism behind politics, behind government, the politics of elections and governments who want to misuse the situation of COVID, to stay in power and make sure that certain narratives come out in a certain way. Big pharma as well, there's need to interrogate that, especially now with these vaccines that are being developed. Even the politics behind religion also right now has to be interrogated, because even behind religion, there is a push for certain agendas, some that are capitalist, some that are not capitalist. So I think in terms of who can be trusted, even in terms of whistleblowers, interrogate the agenda using the guidelines that MIA has set. And once you are clear of the agenda that is behind that, it becomes, easier. And now, with the advent of social media, we have a situation where anyone can be a publisher. Everyone really is just a publisher. So, the interrogation should go beyond just journalists. But the good thing that I think we can see coming out of COVID is that even with so much misinformation, disinformation, and fake news going around, the general public do tend to go back to the center. And for me, the center is media, because they still believe that they can trust good media, that there is people who are passionate and about the truth and are not spoiled by all these agendas. So yeah, I would say interrogate, and then there is still a space for good, credible media. The public always return to that, though they might now take it to social media, but they always come back to the center.
Now, Laeed, I actually also noted that in South African social media, there's been quite a lot of, whistleblowing things coming out, doctors speaking out, people posting invoices that, for really sort of dodgy tenders where they inflated prices. You see that breaking on social media. And I was wondering to what extent your whistleblowers in North Africa are using social media to kind of like feed information so that it gets into the mainstream press.
Yes, Alet. I think in Algeria, social media is free for everyone. Anyone has to say something, he goes to the social media and make his point of view. But when it comes to, of course, when it comes to whistleblower in Algeria, they have been under pressure from the government, and of course we call them intruder. Many video on YouTube of people who get in the hospitals and medical center and so forth and shoot secretly some scenes around with the mess and the anarchy, and they make them public. Of course, the authority are not happy with this way, and some of those who made this YouTube were taken to justice. So I would say journalists as well are put under pressure from ordinary citizens, and of course. Because of the media are not so transparent, let's make it clear. The Algerian media are still learning how to be more democratic, how to be more open, how to be more accountable, how to be more the scientists, epidemiologists. Everyone who wants to say something, he has to express it in the social media, because the media have been less. They have been excluded from the mainstream of the media, and therefore the only alternative for those who have not been given a voice on the ordinary, on conventional media, they are using media to express them, social media, to express themselves, to speak out, and to say some of the things that they consider are true. And of course, here we are in front of a situation where mistrust is around. The government will not tolerate, will not put up this way. The media are put under they are discredited by these people, and specialists, experts, and ordinary people are speaking out their minds. And one way or the other, we should, I think, what happened now, there is no coordination between scientists, between journalists, between whistleblowers or government. Time has come now, they should advocate a coordinated approach. I think more dialogue, more conversation, and we cannot hide the truth from ordinary people. So we have to put pressure on those who detain the information to keep things available, and they must be accountable to the public in order to decrease the huge impact of social media. I think sometimes journalists are feeling really bad and sad because they have not been at all trustful from ordinary people. And I think now it's pity that the social media is polluting the whole climate, political and media climate, and the government has to intervene for more openness, for more transparency in the media, and of course enable everyone to speak out and give them a chance, whether on the platforms or website or any other device.
Exactly. Yes, I think you're absolutely right there. It's really important to kind of get everybody on board and to reinforce media in some ways, to get people to really kind of come to kind of like get over this kind of mistrust that's actually particularly been blowing over from a kind of like the right-wing mode that we've been seeing sort of globally, where all sorts of conspiracy theories have been flowing left and right on social media. And I think, you know, particularly this idea of the responsibility of journalists and the need to work together, I think will really come into its own once we actually have a vaccine. I think that, you know, we've all seen on social media the kind of growing waves of, you know, anti-vaccine kind of propaganda that's been out there. And I'm quite interested to hear from Mia, if you guys have been talking about it, what do we do to kind of like, create a different narrative around vaccines?
So, Laeed, I think the anti-vaxxers, they're really not new. They've been there all along. It's perhaps just that the broader public are now more aware of them because COVID, it centered around COVID. And I think the breaking down the myths goes even beyond just anti-vaxxers. It goes around, it relates to all the sort of myths around COVID. And just to point out that, conspiracy theories about it and that it was created in a lab, it's really not new. It happens in the case of all epidemics. They are always, every single epidemic, whether that was HIV or smallpox or polio or the Spanish flu, there's this thing where people want to blame something. They want to hold someone accountable for what happened. And closely relating to that is conspiracy theories. Everyone comes up with their own ideas. So it's good to see it within context, that it's not a COVID thing, it's an epidemic thing. People want to blame someone and they want to make sense out of how did this happen. And very often the explanation is merely, there was this virus that is new and that we have now, that there's not necessarily someone to blame. But when it comes to vaccines, there are other political issues that came specifically actually with COVID that emerged. And that is not just, does a vaccine work or would you take a vaccine? It's something called vaccine nationalism. It's about how do you make something that was developed mainly in well-resourced countries available to everyone? Who gets it first? And does a country where a vaccine was developed have the right to go and tell the other less resourced countries that we'll take it first and you'll get it after us? And it's also a bit of a stupid scientific argument, because if you withhold it from other people, it's an infectious disease. If they come to your country, they'll bring the virus to your country if you didn't give it to them. But in terms of the media, I have found in our work, and I've seen it in many other media outlets as well, that explanatory journalism has become very, very prominent right now. And by that, I mean short little videos that just explains the issue in a basic way, or Q&As with an expert, what is an antibody test and what is the difference between that and a PCR test. I've seen when we do our work at Bhekisisa that we do a lot more of that now, and the appetite of readers are so much more, so much larger to want to read those things where previously, we wouldn't have produced them as frequently. And the other thing I've seen is, because one thing about a fast-moving epidemic like this is that it creates an appetite for knowledge, and at some that it often requires skills that you don't have yourself. So for instance, at Bhekisisa, we've seen an increasing need for the interpretation of data. If the government releases its figures, people don't just want those figures, they want it to be presented in a meaningful way. And we're now data experts at Bhekisisa. So I have seen the opportunity to create partnerships that we didn't previously had. So for instance, we partnered with a media startup here, Media Hack, that produces a fabulous dashboard that interprets this information. And it's taught me the lesson not to try and reinvent the wheel. We shouldn't try and produce that dashboard. We should rather work with another organization that's really very good at this. And other partnerships that I don't think we would have formed nearly as fast if it wasn't for COVID. So for instance, we formed a partnership with News from Africa, where they don't have health journalist experts, but we can have a daily slot and explain some of the stuff that an average journalist wouldn't always deal with, or going into communities. We don't have the capacity to hang out in a community on a level where we can, for instance, say in Khayelitsha, get all the grassroots information. And there is already an organization doing that. And we partnered with Iwoza, that's an organization that does those type of things. And something that is emerging with COVID is organized crime. We've seen tenders, we've seen huge amounts of corruption. And that is something that perhaps wouldn't have been previously part of our coverage when it came to an epidemic, but it's so important that we can't ignore it. But it moves so fast, we're not specialists in crime reporting. So it's taught us the lesson to partner with someone. We're partnering with a media startup called Viewfinder to do those type of reports. And we can produce the health part of it, but we're certainly not specialists in the crime part. So partnerships, working together with other media organizations is certainly a way to get through this fast-paced moving sort of work requiring so much specialist skills that you might not have yourself, and finding ways to amplify other people's work and sort of like make it fit with what you do.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Mia. In terms of journalists and their role, how can you empower citizens to ask the right questions to governments and to scientists? I mean, I like your example that you just used. Are you partnering with other people to report, say, on corruption around COVID funding? But how do you kind of empower your readers, your viewers, your listeners in terms of asking the right kind of questions to their government officials? Anybody, any of the panelists?
Yeah, I can be very brief on this one. Thanks very much, Julian. So I think, especially in the beginning when the pandemic, broke out, and the months that we were doing the research, which was March and April, there really was an issue that came out in the report in terms of who got a voice in the media, who the media got a voice. So our research found that in that initial period, a lot of the media did not give voice to groups that are maybe marginalized and sometimes who are in the minority. And then what happened is that there was a lot of top-down information. So a lot of government officials, health ministers, permanent secretaries, or director generals of health were given acres and acres of space in print media or in broadcast media, so much airtime to be giving their opinion, their response as the government, and there really was not much that was coming from the bottom, coming up. And this was also later problematic in terms of when the government now tailored its responses and kept on, changing its responses with the pandemic. A lot of these groups were left out of these responses. So, the voices of women, other groups such as indigenous persons, they were left out of responses, responses such as who gets government food packages, who gets what from the government in terms of responses. So I think there really still is an issue in terms of giving a voice and space. While, it's important to hear the government response and what it is planning, I think the effects and the impacts on people's lives, even the impact of the lockdown, it took a while for the media, to start reporting from the sides of the grassroots. So I think it's those who maybe are in broadcast, who are in radio, especially community media, are really at an advantage at such a point because, they have a platform that they can easily give to people and to citizens at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to follow up there, Teldah, I think, what you're pointing out is very much, to have a connection to the ground, because often if you just speak to officials, they always just give you the rosy picture. What we've seen just in our town happening is the issue of stigma coming to be an issue. And I think, if you don't actually report on the ground, if you don't speak to the people directly affected, those kind of issues might not even come up. I don't know if there's anybody else, also Teldah or any of our other panelists who want to talk about this, how do we report on the issue of stigma as journalists?
Can I say one word, Arle?
Yes, please, Laeed.
Yeah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think in the case of Algeria, in order to avoid any kind of stigmatization or misinformation, the authority jumped to set up a scientific committee Exactly, that's exactly what happened. In order to avoid any speculation about this or that, they set up a body, a scientific body, composed of eminent epidemiologists, medical staff, and so forth. And they were the only authority entitled to speak about COVID and its propagation. And this is really and sincerely has stopped any kind of stigmatization, because they have this political and medical authority, and therefore this is the only body in charge of talking and information population about the COVID. And therefore it's new, because beforehand, before that, previously in other crises, whether social or economic or so forth, the politicians who are always first jumping and explaining and having the monopoly. This time, compared to the other, is completely different. And this new body of, as I said to you, scientific and medical body composed at national level, this is the high authority. They are the only one, and the politicians have and must understand and follow what the strategic committee, strategic scientific committee decided about any measure to be taken following the evolution of this COVID. I think at this time, I would say the authority, this scientific authority has done a great job in order to stop any stigmatization. And of course, every day they hold the press conference and they deliver statistics about any kind of things. Of course, there is an attempt from ordinary people to challenge this, and they said, no, this is not right, this is a false figure. But they explain by forcefully and with argumentation that this is done in very methodological way, in very with authority, and more than that, independently from economic or political pressure. And so far it happens and it works. Despite that, in spite of this, still we have some attempts from people on the social media who are still challenging. But overall, the authority, the integrity, the morality of this scientific committee has really stopped any sort of stigmatization.
So I think, that actually speaks directly to Teldah's report. So, I hear what you're saying, that this is an independent body of scientists, but at the same time, we have the situation that only they can speak. I don't know, Teldah, does it sound similar to what you found in your research, or do you think independence helps?
Yeah, it does help, but I suppose what is independence? Because, we have sometimes bodies that are said to be independent, but the appointment of the people who are on those committees, for example, in countries like Zimbabwe, an independent body are appointed by the Minister of Health or Minister of such and such. So, then there's the question of what really is independence, and how much can the agendas behind that independence also be trusted? So I think I would throw that back to North Africa.
Laeed, do you want to respond to Teldah there?
Yes, I think, I think I'm not denying. First of all, I don't have any right whatsoever to challenge these people who are epidemiologists, 20, 30 years of experience. And of course, since they have been appointed on objective criterion of integrity and morality and expertise, I cannot challenge them. What I meant by I don't have to give a lot of political weight on the question of independence. What I want to say, those people, they have to act because they have already signed the hypocrite agreement. So therefore, they have been already morally and ethically engaged to say the truth. And therefore, on medical basis, they have already been engaged on that. And of course, because they don't work for the government, they have been, although they have been appointed by the government, but their independence in terms of medical expertise is unchallenged. Exactly. But I am not I cannot myself as professor and journalist challenge their integrity because their expertise is there, is everywhere. What is important that the politicians do not interfere anymore. The politicians themselves vote publicly. They are at the mercy of the scientific committee to decide and to follow what they suggest to them as guidelines.
Thank you for that. Interesting. I know South Africa has the same kind of scientific body that does the same thing as in Algeria, but Teldah, in any other African country, is that the same thing? Is that a thing that happens with scientific committees being established by government?
Yeah, it is the same in quite a couple of countries. Yeah, that scientific committees are established by the governments. They fall under the Ministry of Health. They report to the permanent secretary or the person who would be called, you know, a director general. So they might have people who have got very good CVs, people who have integrity, but then in terms of how much independence they actually have, I think we have to be careful. It's questionable.
Yeah. Just another question. So social media, as we've already established, anybody can have access to it and anybody can spread disinformation. Is it the media's role to demystify this, to expose this? What do you think should the media do in this particular case, where people just say whatever they want to say, and obviously people follow it and people that listen to it? What's the role of the media in this regard when there's false information online? Anyone?
I think, Julian, the media's role, you would assume that traditional media and well-regulated media has a system through which it filters information. So the difference between social media and a newsroom would be that there would be a structure, a news editor or subs, that information is filtered through to make it more credible or more accurate, as opposed to a social media channel where there's no filter. And in any epidemic, at least part of the role of the media would be to provide information that people who are affected by this epidemic can trust. And that would be the difference between us and, say, channels that are not filtered. However, how equipped are we to provide the accurate information? You know, do we always know it's accurate? And what sort of resources have we got access to help us to do that? And that often depends on the individual journalist or the resources of a media organization or innovation. Something that I find very interesting with a reshaping of the media environment in the COVID context is that media startups that specialize in specific forms of reporting are now becoming more prominent often and more trusted than mainstream traditional media because of these specialist skills. And it would be interesting to see in the future who's going to survive. I personally think media startups are going to increase their relevance, and because they're often donor funded and COVID creates a sort of like a little bit of a philanthropic heaven where you can access money, the chances of survival is going to be bigger than mainstream media, who mainly get their income from events and sponsorships and advertising. And perhaps you're going to see the role of media startups within a mainstream media context to become larger, because media startups are sometimes a little bit better equipped to access these resources to make information more credible because they're so specialized and they know who to access where in their fields. But when it comes to something that you spoke about, for instance, stigma, reporting on stigma, I think often it's as basic as thinking, why do we have stigma and what does it do? And what it does in the case of COVID is it makes people less likely to access testing, essentially. If you're very scared of being stigmatized of something, you're less likely to go and get tested for it, because then you're going to be stigmatized. And then to look at very, very basic things like why do we have stigma? Because of fear. And we have fear because of a lack of access to credible, accurate information, and to look at very, very basic ways of distributing that information, and to also look at holding government accountable to not create stigma themselves, you know, and to practice what they preach, essentially. And if we can do things as basic as that, we will counter things like stigma with a far-reaching effect. But before we can do it, we need to understand the information ourselves as journalists.
Thank you, Mia. Laeed?
We've got a few comments from the chat. I think I've got this someone here, Lila Buskachni, who speaks directly to some of the issues you've raised, Mia, around the importance for journalists to understand the scientific method. And I think you've shared that course that you guys have hosted. We've also shared another course hosted in Kenya for journalists. But we've also had another question raised by Shraddha Patnala, who is particularly concerned about, you know, some of the diseases that are, you know, not COVID-19, but because of our health system being overloaded, you know, people are also affected by other things. She's talking particularly about antimicrobial resistance. As I understand it, is that the same as being resistant to antibiotics?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Mia, I think that might be particularly directed to you, or I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to jump in there before you. Should we bounce that one to Mia directly on the health front?
So yes, that's a very good point, and I think it's not a South African based thing. It happens everywhere in the world at the moment, that because countries have to spend so much resources on COVID and so many hospital beds, and people are scared of going to hospitals because health facilities have become hotspots for infections. People tend to stay away from those health facilities for non-COVID related health matters, and it means that we see an effect of that. In South Africa, for instance, the Medical Research Council released our excess deaths last week, and that means it's deaths that we have that we perhaps that we wouldn't, it's unexpected deaths. If you compare, it's the number of extra deaths that you wouldn't have expected to have had. And a lot of those can be attributed to COVID. But in its release of these results, it also explained that many of those deaths could not be direct COVID deaths, but deaths because people didn't access health facilities for other diseases. So it's absolutely a point, and antimicrobial resistance could be part of that. Obviously, you wouldn't access a doctor as often as you would have, or maybe you get medicine easier than in other circumstances because you don't have a lot of time to go to a doctor. So yes, it's absolutely something we should take in consideration, and we should report on it in our reporting. In South Africa, so obvious HIV and TB, you know, the testing have gone down, people going back to collect their treatment regularly have gone down, and we should be able, as the media, it's important that we keep track of that, because there are going to be so many deaths during the COVID time that are indirect deaths as a result of people not accessing health facilities regularly. And one of the comments our Medical Research Council made with their excess deaths was our number of COVID deaths were far lower than the number of excess deaths in the country. And one of the reasons could be because of the deaths that you see that could also be non-COVID related, because people didn't access health facilities.
We've got some more questions coming in. We do have Virginia Mwanigwa, particularly echoing some of the points that you were making there, Teldah, around the importance of citizens across diversity, that experts should really be responding to the issues raised from the direct experience of ordinary people. You've mentioned that that's a problem. Did you see it happening anywhere, and particularly that journalists did this well?
I think in the first few months of the pandemic breaking out in Southern Africa, this was not done really well at all, and hence, you know, we had late responses or late stories in terms of effects of COVID-19 and in terms of effects of the lockdowns on particular groups of people. You know, it's only 2-3 months down the line that we've now started seeing a few stories in the media, such as effects on women and access to sexual and reproductive rights, such as access to contraception that was hindered by the lockdown, or access to food for children who rely on feeding at school and were disrupted, you know, by the shutdowns, and how that wasn't thought through by the government in the beginning. So certainly I agree with Virginia that the voices of experts and of governments should be the ones who should be speaking in responses to lived experiences. And even like with the issue of stigma, is because we were not getting the voices from the ground coming up, and perhaps now we're starting to see a small turn, but I think they you know, they could be more. Even in the reporting of bailouts, in terms of maybe South Africa has got this big bailout from the IMF, the effects on ordinary people, anticipated and current, that really has not come out in the narrative yet. We have other big agendas, you know, that get in the way. So certainly the voices of citizens across all diversity, especially for marginalized groups. For journalists, we should view this from an ethical point of view, that if you are leaving out the voices of the smaller men and the smaller women, this is an unethical practice. I think that's how we should view it to guide our work.
Sorry about that. We've seen quite a bit of reporting on the issues of corruption coming out based on citizens speaking out. I don't know to what extent, Laeed, that's also been happening in North Africa, where you had, I don't know if you have the issue of corruption there in terms of COVID funds happening there, and if so, if journalists are reporting on this. Are ordinary people breaking the story?
Yeah, yes, you are right. As I said to you, we inherit in Algeria a corrupted system. Everywhere is corrupted, as I said to you, and the right word is democratic corruption that touch all parts of the society. And now with the new leadership, they committed themselves to bring about more transparency, more I would say accountability, and therefore that's why their decision, the political decision, depend exclusively from what the scientific committee decided. And as I said, experts are the key, have the key role in deciding what next. And of course, we have to listen to everybody, but particularly to those who have an expertise in this area of COVID-19. And in order, as a matter of fact, to stop stop the propagation of corruption, because why there is a corruption? Because those who decide are corrupted, are incompetent, are of course they are not in position to explain. They are not source of confidence and trust, and therefore they are abusing of this and that. But when the decision makers are expert, are competent, and of course the government has to set up this body, and right now we have a new body against the corruption, and they have already set up a plan for the next 4 years, from 21 to 25. This body will treat exclusively the corruption problem, which has been, as I said, democratized all over the country. And now there is really a political, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, but as a journalist, as an officer, and as observer what is going on, I think I can guess, I can really feel, I can see that there is a political will from the new leadership to fight the corruption forcefully and fiercely. And the series of now justice, this series of now crimes now that have been taken, all the old political leadership now, most of them are sued in the tribunal and also taken to the prison. Explain the political determination of new leadership to fight corruption. And of course, they didn't attack the small people, but they went to the prime minister, ambassador, general, etc. So I would say there is a real, genuine, and sincere political will to fight corruption everywhere and in all domains.
I think we also had a lot of that optimism about 2 years ago. Don't know where. Hopefully things work out for you in the way that you're hoping there, that the political will actually push us through. I don't know if Teldah or Mia, you guys would like to also just talk about how journalists have been dealing with this issue of COVID corruption.
Before they answer, please, if our viewers just to look at the chat function, there's quite a lot of useful resources being shared by some of our listeners and viewers. So just check on the UNESCO site. There's quite a few information. The South African Scientists Association, they're putting up some information there for you to access. It's free. Please make use of it.
I see Virginia has actually just commented that journalistic analysis should go beyond just calling out corruption and should unpack the health costs with facts and figures. Mia, have you guys done that at Bhekisisa?
We've done some costs, but something that I think relates to that is there was a comment about South Africa's Ministerial Advisory Committee, which is our scientific committee advising the government that it can't talk without a filter through government. Now, I'm not sure I agree. Officially, yes, I agree, but that has happened in practice. I think South Africa is a good example where scientists have found ways in the media to sort of access it in creative ways if their formal position doesn't allow them to do that. So if you're on the Scientific Advisory Ministerial Committee in South Africa, I think only the chairperson can officially speak for that committee. And it's been clear in South Africa that there were a group of scientists who were unhappy about the fact that they didn't have enough of a voice. And so how do they access, they want to hold the government accountable for decisions, and why did they not follow certain advisories that the committee issued? And they have actually been pretty creative by forming a group. You know, there's a group that advises the Daily Maverick, for instance, on when should you quarantine, when shouldn't it, should you go to school, shouldn't you open the schools, and they provided their advice. You know, they serve on the committee, but they don't provide the advice in the media on behalf of the committee. It's on behalf of themselves, and they do get that information out there, creating diversity, you know, so that because there can be healthy disagreements among scientists. I think that's great. I think another great example is we need to hold them accountable to be transparent with their decisions, which is the same that we need to do for corruption, but also for other scientific sort of decisions. So there's been a lot of advisories that this committee has issued the government with, but we haven't seen them. We've seen some of them. We have some of the advisories on our website at Bhekisisa, but particularly the controversial ones as to should the schools open, how full should taxis be, you know, when they transport people, should churches be open. And it's interesting to see that News 24 has filed a PIA request to force the government to provide these advisories, because we want to know if the advisories were not followed by top scientists, why was it not followed? Why they can't just keep quiet about it. And I think those are basic practices that we can use for corruption reporting, obviously, as well. The crime journalists, you know, file PIA requests all the time. And the interesting thing, or encouraging thing for me to see at News 24 is that the group of journalists that inspired this filing of the PIA request are not traditionally health journalists. You know, it's investigative journalists who use their skills in the health field, and I think that is a very healthy thing for that to happen. Health journalists aren't traditionally skilled in filing those PIA requests, and I think that's a very good thing that has happened. And we need absolute accountability and transparency. We want to know why these things happen, but what we shouldn't forget is, as in any field where there are top people at the field, you know, in this case, scientists, there's also competition for prestige. You know, there's definite competition among scientists on this advisory committee as to who is the one that the president calls the most to ask for personal advice. And scientists, just like people in any other field, you know, they compete to be prestigious and to use that prestige to get positions, to become the heads of organizations or faculties or whatever it is. And it's always good to bear that in mind, not to think that scientists are just people in white coats behind microscopes. You know, they also compete immensely among each other. And when it comes to you know, you need to bear that in mind. It's often, what is the agenda? Sometimes it's something as simple as, I want to be the person most quoted about a certain thing, or I want my opinion to be visible. But on the other hand, diversity is so important when we, not just with grassroots opinions, but scientific opinions. And it's important that we give more than one scientist a voice.
Right. There's a comment from Lenina Rasul where she kind of reiterates, Mia, what you've been doing. Media houses should partner with civic organizations who can explain policies, you know. So that's a fairly good comment that you make. So you can read it on the chat. And maybe any civil society organizations that can help the media, I'm sure you guys can connect with one another.
But I think it was a really good point that Teldah made earlier, that we should follow the money, and now Mia's adding that we should follow the kind of politics of influence. You know, I've noted just, you know, obviously we've seen Dr. Stella, but there's also been some South African doctors that have, you know, punted various treatments. And I guess there, you know, one also has to be a bit skeptical. I don't know if you've seen that, Teldah in broader Southern Africa, or Laeed in North Africa, where you have doctors saying, you know, I've got this cure. It sounds kind of scientific, not, you know, totally quack, but you need to ask important questions there. You know, how would you guide a health journalist to report on that?
I think I'll give Laeed an opportunity.
Laeed, do you think you could address that? Just, you know, for example, we've had doctors.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I want to say here in Algeria, sincerely, social media are a headache for the media as well as for the government alike. I have already suggested in so many occasions that the government as well as the media should integrate social media in their strategy of communicating the information. In other words, journalists, ordinary journalists, professional journalists, they do not only suffuse to work on a traditional way, but they should also be active themselves. They should be active in the social media. They have their own Facebook, their own YouTube, in order really to change all those citizen people who are citizen journalists who have no scientific or media background, in order to at least more impetus to what they do and more professionalism. Otherwise, they will remain a mercy of all the misinformation and fake news that are taking all over the media sphere. And it is important for the journalists. They should now invest in social media and use, as I said, Facebook, YouTube, and so forth. They should result in at all tribunals, websites, in order really to move on and to integrate more ethical, more professional skills and more, of course, media requirement. Otherwise, they will be overthrown by citizen journalists.
Yes, I think they have a very, important role for journalists to play on social media. And actually, we've seen a lot of scientists also, becoming more and more active. Just lots of epidemiologists I've seen emerging, being very active on Twitter. This whole thing of keeping up with the science and being able to intervene. I mean, I'm quite interested in our government. Initially the World Health Organization, also the big message was cleaning. And I think, now, only belatedly did people start speaking about masks. That became a thing. And now there's much more of a sense that actually, the fomite infection is not such a big risk. Our biggest risk is being in small enclosed spaces with other people. And that is a statistical risk, even if, my sense is even if you wear a mask, there is some risk, and that you should really be aware of, things like opening windows. And that's not something that really we've seen much of in the South African media, at least. I've seen a lot of that reporting in international sites like the Atlantic, for example, Washington Post, whatever. But we've, from my experience, there's hardly been anything in local media around the risks of ventilation and, enclosed spaces, etc. Mia, do you want to comment on that one?
I think we've seen a little bit of ventilation reporting with regards to taxis, right? When the government announced that if you have local taxis that are filled up to 100%, the rule would be to have a window open on both sides because of ventilation. We could, as you've pointed out, see more. But the interesting thing that was just mentioned is like social media. Social media can also be used to our advantage. A really good example recently is there was a scientist in Forbes magazine last week who published a column that argued that there are two vaccines, one in the US and one at Oxford University, that are in phase 2 trials. Trials normally have 3 or 4 phases. And that because we know it's safe from the first and second phase, and that it works to some extent, we should allow people who want that vaccine to access it because we've got nothing else. And that's a very, very dangerous statement to make, because often, even with safety, when you get into a phase 3 trial, which involves a lot more people than in phase 1 or 2, some safety issues may emerge that didn't emerge previously because they weren't as common. And now, because you have a large group of people, it may come out. And also it could create a false sense of safety, and people could start to stop wearing their masks or to social distance because they think they've got a vaccine that works that hasn't been proven to work. And as a result of that article on social media, there was an outcry about it from other scientists, from other media outlets. And the pressure was so large on social media that as a result of this, the scientist had to publish another Forbes column that retracted and explained why he was wrong. And I don't think if it was just published sort of like, if there was just criticism within the publication, the outcry, if there wasn't social media, the outcry wouldn't have been able to be as powerful. And after that outcry, there wasn't just a column in Forbes, there was also a New York Times article that criticized him. So we should also sort of use that power and sometimes recognize the power that can be used for the good, because in this case it resulted in more accurate science as opposed to myths or unregulated stuff. And as you've mentioned, scientists should become aware of how powerful they can be on social media and acquire the skills, just like we in the media have to acquire the skills to report on science. They have to acquire the skills to use things like social media to their advantage, because it's essentially their own printing press, and they can't pretend it doesn't exist in this day and age. They have to use it.
Thank you. Mia, I know, Teldah, you might want to answer or comment, but there's a question for Mia, or at least a comment. Maybe Teldah, first you want to go, and then I'll kind of raise it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly that in addition to what Mia said, I think we need to be aware of the power of religion, I think, in the region. It came out very strongly, not only in terms of like disinformation and issues of cures, but even as force that is really against scientific journalism, if you like, most of the things that come out through scientific journalism, such as this wearing of masks and so forth. I think we are all quite aware in the region of the rise of religious leaders that are called prophets or papas or whatever the case may be here in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, very prevalent in Eswatini, and how this is also very damaging to science journalism itself. So I think even amongst journalists in our research that we did in the countries that I've mentioned, amongst journalists, there is a very disturbing trend that is there of, journalists are also human beings. They are people who belong to these societies, of journalists who say this disease is not scientific, it's spiritual. So, we cannot bring the science to argue with the spiritual. So that really also, in terms of coverage and in terms of what is on social media, in terms of fake news, disinformation, that was a real concern for us as well in the research findings.
Oh, great. Mia, so the comment from Ida Juester is, you say diversity is important, but it feels like the media audience needs to be guided through understanding how healthy diversity is different from, you see, even scientists can't agree, so we are doomed. Kind of type of thinking. So, which is something we've seen with a very overwhelmed audience. Citizens are being bombarded with all kinds of information, and now they see that scientists are fighting with one another. So it creates anxiety and stress. How do we deal with that?
I almost feel like you need to get Ida to answer it. I think she will have a very, very good answer to this. But what I can say is that I think Ida is absolutely right, and I think you are also right. It creates anxiety, and I think that is why it's so important that we provide context within our reporting. And the one piece of really important context is that COVID is different from, say, HIV, where we have clear answers to many issues, and that has been around for 30 years. It's been around for 7 to 8 months. In most of the cases, we simply don't know the answer. And if we don't provide that context, then we create an impression that there should be clear answers to things, which they just isn't yet, because there hasn't been enough time. The one tool we can use as journalists when we're confused about a scientific finding is something called systematic reviews or meta-analysis, which is studies that are done. They take all the studies that have tried to answer a certain question and pull the data together and then see what all that data tells us about a certain question. A question could be, for instance, does a certain medicine work to, say, prolong your life, for instance, when you have COVID, or make the period longer between, illness and having to go onto a ventilator. And those studies are very good tools to use to tell us how much certainty is there, how many studies have found, a clear answer or something before or against a certain question in a certain field. And that's why we need we need to train journalists in study designs when it comes to COVID to be able to understand that those tools are there to be used. But Ida is right, diversity has a downside to it as well, because if there are so many disagreements in the media, what is the public supposed to think? The only way we can really counter that is to filter who we use. We need diversity, but to make sure the right scientists speak within the right fields, to not just quote people for the sake of diversity, and to really look at the context we can provide within that field, and to provide that context of it's not just here that we don't know, it's everywhere. It's not a South African thing. Perhaps that would curb some of the anxiety. Ida, you may have more advice. I know you work in this field, and you may have very useful things to say.
No, I think you said it exactly right. Yeah, I think, I mean, the issue of uncertainty in science and sort of journalists learning to speak with a more tentative voice, providing the kind of context that you provide through Bhekisisa is just incredibly important. I have seen in Daily Maverick, which does a lot of great stuff, but I've also seen kind of one day one scientist says one thing, the next day another says something that feels contradictory if you don't know the full context. And I think that is really confusing in South Africa, at least.
His mic has dropped, a really important point. We are starting to wrap up. So I think what we're going to do now is to allow each of the speakers, maybe starting with Laeed, to give us a bit of a kind of final word, you know, from you in terms of, you know, what do you think, you know, journalists really need to hold on to in terms of reporting on COVID-19?
I think we have to be somehow kind with journalists. We cannot put a lot of pressure on them. We cannot expect them to be expert at everything. Of course, in the case of Algeria, not all of the journalists have medical or scientific background, because our faculties do not provide studies on scientific journalism. There is only one high school which does, but still with limited number of journalists. I think what we expect from journalists is to be professional, to be transparent, to be efficient, to be really objective. They should be a vacuum. They should offer a vacuum, a tribune, a space for experts and specialists. They should look for the right person, for the right scientific person who can really contribute, who can provide an added view to the scientific debate. That is most important in the term, the journalist, although we don't expect him to be expert at everything, but at least we should force him to choose the right person, the right expert, the right epidemiologist, and to let him express himself. That is most important for journalists. Journalists should also be aware of and be curious to be present at all different, as I said, platforms. He should be as I said, on the traditional and the conventional media, as well on the other social media, in order to contribute with his objective background, objectivity, impartiality, and ethical. I would say in the case of Algeria, of course, this is depending on the political climate. And here I am asking for the political system to be more transparent, more open, give a chance, of course, give everybody a chance to speak out, let journalism express them, do their job in professional way. Also enable specialists, especially in this COVID problem. They should allow epidemiologists, scientific, medical staff to express. And of course, here in Algeria, for instance, we have another partner, as one of our speakers said. We have also the religious authority. The religious authority have also their say on how to run, how to organize the lockdown, and then the removal of the lockdown. So we have so many lobbies around. But in the end of the day, what is important is that the media should be the vehicle of sincere and reliable information in order to get the people catch the idea, get the message, and also behave accordingly to the message.
Thank you. Teldah, your last comment.
Wow, yeah, so much. But I think I'll briefly just say that, of course, to the journalists, there is need for reporting meaningfully from communities and not just like a top-down approach. Then I think to people who are activists or to media development organizations such as ourselves as Internews, is that I think in the coming months, we're already seeing that there's an increase in reporting on corruption that's related to COVID-19, and that's great. But we need to also now be prepared to support investigative journalists who are going to and are already feeling the backlash from such reporting. So you'll see in Zimbabwe right now, we have journalists who are practically at war with the state, who are imprisoned for reporting on corruption on COVID-19. And the same can be said in Tanzania, where, you know, the government is just keen to put a lid on anyone who wants to do that sort of reporting. And then lastly, I'll say, you know, it's important for us to build a healthy information ecosystem that starts with good journalism, because ultimately we should not separate media from public health, because, you know, one enables the other. So we need to look at it from a point of view of saying that a healthy media and a healthy information ecosystem actually enables good access, good use of public health, and it saves lives. So I think that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Mia, over to you.
I think Teldah has really summarized it. I agree with everything she said. And a short addition to that is, I think we're now in the era of partnerships, whether that is partnerships among media, or whether among media organizations and media and civil society, or media and epidemiologists and scientists. It's the way we're going to survive this epidemic, is by acknowledging each other's skills and making it work together.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Good.
Thank you so much to all our fabulous panelists. I think that was really insightful. If you want to watch it again, please note that we will be posting it onto YouTube directly after this meeting. So you can actually share it with other people. And we've also asked all of the speakers to share their email addresses in case you'd like to continue the conversation with them. So I guess you'll be able to find that on the Highway Africa website. And also to note that you'll soon be receiving an email just to ask you to evaluate this webinar, because we would really appreciate your feedback. We have a whole series of webinars, so we're hoping you're going to be joining us for the next one.
Thank you, and goodbye from all of us. Please note the resources that are available is in the chat functions. And again, the emphasis should be on partnerships, forming partnerships, and media training. There's lots of media training on health journalism that's available. Please see the comments, and I think we can do this. We can really work together. Yes.
I see quite a few of the panelists are sharing their email right now. So if you want to quickly go and grab it there, please do so. Yeah, so that's all of us from the Eastern Cape. Sale kakuhle, as we say over here. Stay well.
Take care. Cheers.